Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Ken Schultz. I'm the faculty director of the program in international relations. And so it's my honor and privilege to get to kick off this wonderful event, our IR Honors Conference. This is a wonderful opportunity to hear about the research that Emily, Veronica, Erica, and Maili have been doing for the past year and to celebrate their accomplishments. It's also a chance for us to thank everybody who's helped support this and make it possible, including the faculty advisors, our IR staff, Paul and Lynn, all the family who are here who've supported their students along the way, and of course, Dr. Gould, who runs our program. I would just say that doing an honors thesis is a remarkable way to cap off an undergraduate career. It gives students the ability to make the transition from being a consumer of knowledge to being a producer of knowledge, and to use and build on what they learned during their time here to produce an original piece of research. There's lots of ways at Stanford that we try to get undergraduates involved in the university's research mission, but nothing matches the honors thesis for the independent research and the sustained involvement that it entails. Now, of course, when they started on this long road way back during the spring of last year, there is no way we could have anticipated where we would be ending up, and that we would all be here looking at each other's faces in little boxes. And I'm really sorry about that. The disruption that you all had to deal with, having to move off campus with little notice, losing access to the library, and most of all, losing in-person contact with one another. I mean, it's just been an incredible obstacle to have to overcome. An honors thesis is challenging even under normal times. And so I think we should be particularly in awe of this group of students for pulling it off under the exceptional circumstances that we find ourselves in today. So I just want to say congratulations to you as we get started on this. And then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gould, as I said, the director of our program, who will be emceeing today's events.
Thank you so much, Professor Schultz. I echo everything that you said. I'm also in awe of this group of students who, as you'll see, have produced remarkable research. But I just want to run over the sort of ground rules of our meeting. This conference is going to be running from 12 to 2. It is being recorded. You should have been aware of that when you joined the meeting, so that you're aware of that. All audience members should be muted for the entire presentation, and unless they're called upon by me. We will begin with Emily's presentation, and her presentation will run approximately 30 minutes, and then it will be followed by about 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer. If you have a question, please send me a message via chat. You can do it directly to me. Again, my name is Erica Gould, so you can send me a message via chat and let me know that you have a question. You don't need to put the question in the chat, but do let me know what your affiliation is. For example, if you're a Stanford student or Stanford faculty member or a family member, so that I'm aware of who I'm calling upon, and let me know. I will call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and ask a question. After Emily's presentation, we'll have question and answer. We will have a brief break where everyone can stretch and use the bathroom and do whatever they need to do, and then we will resume and have Veronica Kin's presentation. She will similarly present for approximately 30 minutes, followed by 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer with the same format. At the end of the entire conference, we will have a brief celebration and virtual reception for the family, advisors, and the IR honors students themselves. So everyone else the presentation will end, and then we will continue on to that reception. So to begin, I'd like to present Emily Bishko and her honors thesis presentation. Her thesis is entitled "Of Dinners and Diplomacy: What White House State Dinners Reveal About Relationship Building and Goodwill Signaling in U.S. Foreign Policy."
Thank you, Professor Gould. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So, like Professor Gold mentioned, my name is Emily, and I've spent the past year researching how White House state dinners fit into the US diplomatic toolbox. So I'm really excited to share some of my findings with you today. When you think of a White House state dinner, you might think of the really fancy dresses or the tableware or the food. But what you might not realize is that behind all of this glamour, these events are innately political. They are between the US president and a foreign head of state or government. They can take months and up to hundreds of thousands of dollars to put on. Each honored country is chosen specifically by the US president with the council of his top policy advisors, and the events generate tremendous press coverage, both within the US and the guest country, but around the world as well. However, little to no academic research has been conducted on the patterns behind what dinners actually occur, which is exactly what I aim to do in my thesis by asking, how do White House state dinners relate to US foreign policy? I came to this topic because I was interested in how interpersonal relationships relate to US foreign policy and international relations more generally. And as I started looking into what these famous friendships were and what effects they had, the results were inextricably linked with White House state dinners. And I realized that I could use these events as a measure of how the US aimed to reach out to foreign states to build this interpersonal relationship aspect of their relationship. As any protocol hawks in the room may have already noticed, though, I'm actually using a rather liberal definition of what a state dinner is. So the US government has a ton of different distinctions between various types of visits that they will receive or give to foreign leaders. However, sometimes the difference between these visits is as small as to whether the arriving visitor receives a 21-gun salute or a 19-gun salute. So to the metaphorical naked eye, they are practically indistinguishable, meaning that their effects and presumably the intentions behind them are quite similar. Additionally, the visits are more than just the dinner. So the dinner is a very highly visual component of a series of days in which this foreign guest is the primary focus of US foreign policy, meaning that the contact between these leaders is much bigger than that just which occurs at the dinner itself. So in order to answer this question, I subdivided further, and this roughly follows how I conducted my thesis and how I will conduct this presentation today. So first, I tried to determine what the effects dinners can have in international relations, which is a theory I developed primarily through my literature review. Next, I was curious about who gets invited to the dinners, which I examined by doing a quantitative analysis in which I mapped a series of characteristics to whether or not a country was likely to get a dinner to try to see any patterns that emerged within the dinner guests. However, this didn't cover why the dinners actually happened. So to answer that, I turned to qualitative case studies in which I researched the dinners that happened under Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan. I conducted these case studies through interviews, by consulting histories, and most importantly, by traveling to various archives. And then I will conclude this presentation like I concluded with my thesis, with a look towards the so what for academia and for policy. Of course, this thesis is premised upon the idea that interpersonal relationships and by extension individuals matter in international relations. This is something that has been argued from scholars ranging from Archie Brown to former IR honors student Rachel Morrow, but it is not fully accepted within international relations yet. However, dinners in specific have two relationship building components that they can use to affect international relations. On the one hand, they're relationship builders, which is what I intuited when I first approached this project. Anthropologists and sociologists have all sorts of fancy terminology they use to refer to this process, but I find it easiest just to use personal examples because after all, world leaders are people too, even though I feel like we sometimes forget that in academia. So on the one hand, dinners and the associated visits are great opportunities for face-to-face diplomacy. When you're talking to someone else, whether they're a foreign leader or just a foreign citizen face-to-face, you can cut out a lot of noise of their transactions and of the communications. And this has been shown to help facilitate the negotiation process and allow the leaders to assess dynamics, which makes it easier to reach a conclusion sometimes than when they're just a name in the ether. However, what distinguishes dinners from other types of visits is that within the invitation itself, there's both a signal and an affirmation of the relationship. So just like now when we are all in self-isolation, and I believe I speak for more than myself when I say if I receive a message from someone, I am very touched by that, and it immediately allows me to look more positively on that relationship and to want to continue building it. And that is exactly what happens when a US president invites another a figure to dinner at the White House. They are saying that we want to continue working with you, and that is the same as proclaiming kinship, which is also akin to proclaiming trust. However, these elements have some commonality shared with other visits that happen at the White House. What distinguishes the state visits that include a dinner in particular is the signaling aspect. As I mentioned, the dinners are fairly highly publicized, both within the US, in the guest country, and around the world more generally. So everybody can see that the US is gesturing goodwill to this country, that they want to work with them closer. And it is also an implicit approval of their activities. So it is the US saying that we approve of what you are doing. And this was the theory I developed with relation to my literature review, but when I turned to the archives, I found that these were exact motivations for why a visit might happen. So for instance, in advance of a visit by Prime Minister Begin of Israel in 1981, President Reagan was told that one of the primary goals for the visit was for them to become friends and get to know each other, and that this would lead to a more productive and closer relationship. Similarly, when President d'Estaing of France visited Ford in 1976, he told Ford that the visit was important for emotional reasons and for its symbolic connotations, and he explicitly stated that he was glad the press was picking up on this. But of course, this does not explain who the dinner recipients actually are and who is the target of these endeavors. So for that, I turn to a quantitative analysis. This analysis was made possible in large part due to the data sharing of Christopher Hickey, who is actually with us today. And he had written an article on all the food that had been served at these dinners from Franklin Roosevelt onwards. And he generously shared the list of dinners he had curated for that research with me, which allowed me to really explain how the dinners mapped onto various variables as defined by other political scientists. So for this research, I did a series of descriptive statistics in which I explained who is invited to the dinners, and then I ran a few regressions. This data set was able to cover every dinner from the first one under President Ulysses S. Grant in 1874 through the last dinners under President Obama. I chose to exclude President Trump's dinners from this data set just because his administration is still in process and much of the data I am using for the research had not yet been updated for these recent years. However, I do want to note that President Trump has hosted 2 dinners to date, which puts him on track to host the fewest number of dinners since President Calvin Coolidge. So all in all, there have been 408 instances in which a foreign leader has been invited to a White House dinner. This includes multilateral dinners in which multiple leaders have been invited at once, as well as bilateral dinners in which it is a one-on-one interaction. The 409th such instance was planned for this past April, but like the in-person version of this presentation, it was canceled due to COVID-19. We see that dinners started in 1874, but they really grew in popularity with Franklin Roosevelt, who also really started to standardize what we think of when we think of a state dinner. And this coincides with the development of the more interconnected world order, as well as the sort of aircraft travel, which facilitated such visits. Dinners remained a highly popular tool kind of until the first George Bush, and then there was a second decrease in popularity with the second George Bush. However, even within the administrations, a pattern emerges as to when a dinner occurs. So for instance, 2-term presidents will actually have more dinners in their second term. And many presidents will favor having dinners in their second and their 5th terms more specifically, which gives them time to have the dinners after getting some ground under their feet. Meanwhile, they have the fewest dinners in their 4th year because they are prioritizing re-election campaigns and dinners or foreign policy endeavor that can get put to the wayside if need be. Equally interesting is the patterns of when in the guests' administrations are they invited to dinners. So 35% of dinners happen for countries within 2 years of new leadership. And this indicates that dinners can be used as a welcome mat to recognize and share policy objectives with these new leaders. However, please note that there is also 21% of dinners that happen for guests in their 11th plus year of leadership, indicating that democracy might not be as important in deciding who a dinner guest might be as I had originally hypothesized it might be. So who are the recipients of all of this reach out? Well, these guys. And in particular, the United Kingdom, which has received 24 invitations to date. They are closely followed by West Germany and their reunited successor. And indeed, West Germany's the United Kingdom and Italy are the only countries to have been invited by every president, with the exception by every president since Lyndon Johnson. And when we look at just the breadth of countries that have been invited, you see these traditional allies, you see traditional rivals like China and Russia, and you also see that there's a huge discrepancy in the number of times each country has been invited, which made me wonder, like, what is it that unifies these countries to get an invite? So for that, I turned to regressions. And in particular, I chose to run a Logit regression on the bivariant variable on whether or not a country received any dinner in any given administration. And I chose to work with this bivariant variable because in theory, you are only meant to have one state dinner per country, per administration. So the number of dinners in a year is very close to being binary anyways. And this really sought to assess whether a country during a specific time was dinner worthy. So I had a number of hypotheses I wanted to assess, ranging from how democratic the country was, to how strong they were, to how amicable they were with the US. And I examined this latter point by looking at how similar their alliance portfolio was, how much trade they had, how many militarized disputes they had, how many treaties and alliances they were in together, as well as how much they politically agreed with them as measured by the voting records in the United Nations General Assembly. These last several variables all approximated the same idea in my mind, but when I actually went to look at them, I realized that they did not correlate to each other, which is why I kept them all in my analysis. Based on past political science research, I was able to operationalize these into variables and then plug them into my regression to get the coefficients you see here. And there's a large range in the values of in the magnitudes of each of these coefficients, but this is primarily a reflection of the large ranges that is found within each of the variables. So after some more plugging and chugging and holding variables at their means, as I examined the expected outputs of just one of them at a time, and various cooperative methods, I was able to figure out that strength was the single most important determinant of whether a country was invited to a state dinner. And this makes sense. If the US is using the dinner to reaffirm a traditional relationship, it makes sense that the relationships they would most want to keep up to date and reaffirmed would be those from their strong allies. Secondly, the second most important one was the militarized conflicts. So we find that if you are in active dispute with another country, you are not likely to be invited. That country is not likely to be invited to a dinner. And this is primarily, and in fact, this is the only variable that was negatively correlated with all of the hypotheses, which makes sense. If they're in active dispute, you aren't going to be invited, but if you are stronger, you're more likely to be invited. And importantly, all of the variables were shown to be statistically significant. However, so all presidents followed these basic principles, but we see that each president, with the exception of John Kennedy, but we see that they had different flavors for how exactly they applied them. And you can see this already with the presidents that I examined more in depth in my case studies, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. So you can see that that these three presidents all preferred countries to be highly democratic, with quality scores between 9 and 10. However, the second largest contingent for all of them were these stronger autocratic nations with quality scores towards the end of the spectrums. But you can also see that Carter was much more inclined to invite these such nations than either his predecessor or successor. Of course, this led me to ask more in depth, well, why are these countries invited, and especially why are they invited when they are? So for that, I turned to histories, I turned to interviews, and I turned to archival documents. And so I was awarded a grant from Stanford to be able to travel to the libraries under Carter and Reagan. And to do so, I found some documents that revealed why exactly these dinners happened. I chose to focus my analysis on these three presidents because they happened during the time of peak dinner popularity, but they did not happen so long ago that they are no longer their practices are no longer represented today. And for the sake of the presentation today, I will be focusing on the invitations that happened under President Carter. So President Carter really liked his dinners, so invitations like the one that you see here, but much fancier, were distributed with some frequency. President Carter is also notable for having the dinner with the single most guests in terms of the honored countries invited at once. So he had a dinner on September 7th, 1977, on the eve of the signing of the Panama Canal Treaty, in which he invited 27 states from the Western Hemisphere. And even more notably, the one state that he did not invite was Cuba, which just again goes to show that when you're in dispute with the United States, and at the time Cuba did not have normalized relationships, that you would not be invited to a state dinner. Carter was a particularly interesting case study because when I went to the archives, I found that he had documents that explicitly laid out why a dinner would happen in that year, or that there were suggestions for the dinner guests for that coming year. So there was a whole series of these documents, but only 2 were made accessible by the time of my visit to the library. So the first one was from September 4th, 1978, and it was written by Executive Secretary Peter Tarnoff of the State Department to National Security Advisor Dr. Brzezinski. The second one was written from December 23rd, also by Tarnoff, and it updated the suggested invites. However, I really wish the other documents were also made accessible, because of the 10 countries recommended between these 2 memoranda, only 1 actually received a dinner: Thailand. And if it makes sense that if one were to receive a dinner, it would be Thailand, as Thailand was the #1 recommended country. But it still doesn't explain fully what the dinners ended up happening were. However, these documents are still useful because they show what the thought process was behind the dinners that the US had intended to happen, and it shows what they were looking for in the dinner guests. So for instance, we see that Thailand was invited as an endorsement dinner. They were looking to approve of the policies and to recognize how this prime minister had changed over the one prior. Meanwhile, Cameroon was considered as a dinner guest because the US thought that by reaching out to Cameroon, they could ally with what they saw as an important force for peace and stability in Central Africa. And similarly, they thought that they could actually get along with Cameroon's president. However, ultimately, Cameroon was not even suggested as an invitation for the year, and instead listed as an alternate because President Carter had already established contact with other leaders from that region. And this just shows us that there is a geostrategic element of who they're choosing to invite to their dinners. They're trying to maximize the spread of geographies that they can reach out to, and they're doing so with the intent of being mindful about that. We learn even more from the dinners that did end up happening for 1979. So there are more dinners that happened than these 4, but these 4 in particular exemplify that dinners are active responses to the international system. 2 of the dinners were celebratory. So for instance, the dinner for Egypt and Israel happened after they signed the Camp David peace accords. And these accords were nowhere near the final product in 1978. It was not thought that they would be able to come to fruition. But so when they did, and Carter wanted to recognize the monumentality of this agreement, he followed the ceremony with the state dinner for Egypt and Israel. Similarly, the dinner with China happened because they had normalized relations on January 1st of that year. And as a recognition of this new improvement in their relationship, they had a state dinner within the month before the embassy had even opened. Meanwhile, the dinner for Mexico happened as part of a larger effort to improve Mexican-American relations, especially in result to the oil crises, such as that resumed at the beginning of 1979. And indeed, oil featured heavily within the toasts that the presidents exchanged to each other at the dinner. And then finally, the dinner for Margaret Thatcher just shows again that the dinners can be used as a welcome mat to recognize new leaders. So Prime Minister Thatcher had come to become Prime Minister in 1979 after a surprise vote of no confidence triggered a general election. So she was not anticipated to be a new leader by the time the memoranda were written in 1978. But once she did become the Prime Minister, she saw it prudent to meet with Carter. Carter saw it prudent to meet with her, and they used the opportunity to recognize each other as well as to square their foreign policy objectives. So between the memoranda and the dinners that actually happened, I was able to identify that there are 4 main reasons for which a dinner would occur. And these findings were repeatedly echoed throughout the Ford and the Reagan case studies as well. So on the one hand, a dinner might occur because the US wanted to endorse the behavior of that country. This is what you see with Thailand. However, we also see that when the US considers a country's behavior unendorsable, the dinner will not happen. So for instance, in 1981, President Reagan hosted President Chun of South Korea for a visit, But that visit did not include a dinner, primarily because Korea was still under martial law and President Chun had been accused of some human rights abuses, and they did not believe that he was endorsable. Another reason a dinner might occur was to build that regional influence. So we see that when Carter chose to invite all of the Western Hemisphere, and indeed he invited every single leader that came to have a one-on-one meeting with him. So he is using it as an opportunity to become closer to that leader. We also see the building regional influence aspect when he chose to not invite Cameroon because he already felt like he had overrepresentation from that region. Still, other dinners happen because the US is looking to maintain traditional relationships. So this explains why you have so many dinners for the United Kingdom, Israel, France, Japan, and especially when a relationship seems to have reached its on-paper peak, the dinners are used to say, like, no, you are still important, we are reaffirming this relationship. And often in these dinners, the leaders will actually talk about their foreign policy initiatives to make sure that they are on the same page. And then finally, dinners are used to celebrate diplomatic breakthroughs. We saw this with the Panama Canal Treaty dinner. We saw this with the Camp David Treaty dinner. We saw this with the normalization of China dinner. And we also see it when President Reagan hosted the Soviet Union for dinner after they signed the INF Treaty. And even more importantly, it seems like dinners might meet multiple of these criteria, but if a nation does not allow the US to pursue at least one of these goals, it will not be invited to a dinner. So now that we know why a dinner occurs, who the dinners occur for, or how a dinner can affect international relations, so what now? Well, more research, of course. This is a piece of academia, and that means it opens as many questions as it closes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I was using a very liberal term for what a state dinner was. But if someone wanted to investigate the nitty-gritty, the distinctions between what a state dinner was versus the official dinners versus when the US travels to another country instead, that would be a compelling inquiry. Additionally, there was a whole domestic side to the dinners. So in addition to the honored country and their delegation at the dinner, there are like sometimes hundreds of celebrities and congressmen and campaign donors and other influential figures in the United States that receive a coveted invitation to come to the dinner itself. And I suspect that there is a whole political science behind who these are chosen to be. And indeed, from my archives, I saw that often influential affiliates of the United States and the other country would be invited. So for instance, for many of the Israeli dinners, it seems as though many influential Jewish Americans were invited. But this would be a whole other side of the dinners that's worth investigating. And finally, and most importantly, in my opinion, I would look into what the effects of the dinners are and see actually how they do affect international relations. However, even from just looking at what those intended effects are, we come to understand that relationships and personalities matter in international relations. This is something that is implicitly understood by policymakers, but it is not always examined within academia. Secondly, we learn that signaling is strategic. So especially in a world where so much is caused, so many disputes are caused by misperceptions, any opportunity that the United States has to show that this is behavior that we approve of, or this is where we're going to focus our geostrategic interests, can be really helpful in figuring out what a state's intents are, or what they are aiming to do. And then finally, dinners are used to emphasize relationships. And they are very much a bridge that the United States can use to reach out to another state that they already have relationships established with. So they're not used to start something, but they can be used to cement an improving relationship and make it even stronger or to reaffirm that. And with that, I would like to thank you for attending my presentation today, and I'd like to thank in particular Dr. Raker for being my incredible advisor and for always inspiring me to read another book and to think deeper, as well as my IR cohort, including our fearless director, Dr. Gold, and then those that lent their time and wisdom to this project, including Adrian Miller, Christopher Hickey, Capricia Penovic-Marshall, and Ambassador Micah McFall, who added an additional depth of research to this. And while let us all hope for a world in which you can once again enjoy lavish dinners, until then, I am happy to yield to questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Veronica Kim, and welcome to my honors thesis presentation. As Dr. Gould said, my thesis is called Clinging to Power, British Economic Policy and Political Coercion in Egypt from 1930 to 1952. And today I will be discussing how the British Empire employed concurring strategies of economic diplomacy and political coercion throughout its informal empire during the beginnings of imperial decline. So We'll see in a moment, though, that the story is a little bit more complicated than it seems. So my interest in this subject emerged from my junior year from a number of really fascinating classes that I took discussing political economy and the Middle East. So I would highly recommend Judith Goldstein's America and the World Economy and Lisa Blade's Middle Eastern Politics. Drawing upon what I learned in these classes, I chose a thesis topic that was entirely out of my comfort zone, hoping to challenge myself to learn and to engage deeply with it over the past year. While I can assure you that it has certainly been very challenging, I can also say that it has been an incredibly rewarding experience. And I owe a debt of gratitude to my advisor, Dr. Robert Rakove, to our fearless leader, Dr. Erica Gold, and to my wonderful IR honors women, Emily, Erica, and Maili. And with that being said, I will give a brief overview of what I'll be discussing in this presentation. So first, I will be presenting a very brief economic and political view on the British Empire, specifically from about the mid-19th century to World War I. This historical context section will set up some of the main philosophies that drove the empire's imperial policy, which, as we'll see, depended on a combination of economic and political measures. Second, I will be introducing my research question and my argument and speaking to the specific importance of Egypt as a case study for my thesis. Third, I will walk you through the findings of one of my empirical chapters on World War II and demonstrate how the state of Anglo-Egyptian relations during the war years supports the overall argument of my thesis. And finally, I will end with some broader significance and takeaways from my research. So first, we have a brief economic and political view of the British Empire. So at its height, the British Empire was the largest empire in history. Here is the Roman Empire at its height. Here is the Mongolian Empire, which was actually the second largest empire in history and the largest continuous land empire. And over the course of its lifetime, here is a map of all of the territories spanned by the British Empire. And by 1913, the British Empire contained over 400 million people, which was about 23% of the world's population at the time. The now famous phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," arose from the fact that the sun was literally always shining on at least one imperial territory. And so for 100 years, from the early 19th to the early 20th century, the British Empire was the most dominant political and economic force in the world. And this latter point is particularly important. Because the empire was so economically powerful, it was able to dictate the way that many other countries' economies functioned and the policies that they followed. And in the mid-19th century, the empire adopted a new philosophy, one that was called free trade imperialism, which John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson discuss in their seminal paper, The Imperialism of Free Trade, published in 1953. And what was significant about British free trade imperialism was that it believed in this inextricable link between economic and political power, particularly within informally ruled regions of the empire. So there was this idea that political action aided the growth of economic power, and in turn, economic power strengthened political influence. And free trade imperialism argued that the British Empire grew as much from informal rule as it did from formal rule, because the British government could use its political influence to extend its economic reach over a country without ever having to directly colonize or rule that country. And obviously this was a favorable outcome for the British because direct colonial rule was often very expensive, and the British government wanted to avoid expending excessive time and resources on direct rule if political power could be attained through indirect means. So these strategies to grow informal empire were very effective at the height of British political and economic dominance, but World War I did have a significant impact on imperial power. As you can see in this graph, Britain suffered the greatest direct costs of the war. And after the war ended, the British government's focus turned inward towards paying off wartime debts and funding desperately needed social and public services for the British people. And when the Depression hit in 1929, Britain's relative economic position in the world slipped further. And its political power had also taken a hit. By 1931, the British dominions, which included Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, South Africa, and the Irish Free State, had gained legislative independence from Britain. So it further reduced the empire's worldwide spread and authority. So by 1930, therefore, the British Empire had begun its decline. And these processes of decline were twofold. They comprised the absolute decline in the power of the British imperial state and the relative decline in British economic power compared to its rivals after World War I. And of course, this didn't go unnoticed by the British government. And while the government, of course, wanted to retain control over its territories, it also really didn't want to engage in potentially expensive conflicts overseas, just given the current economic climate. And as a result, the British government began to seek new methods to continue exerting British power and influence throughout the empire in effective but informal ways. So this leads me to the puzzle that originally motivated my research question. I'll talk you through my question and then give you some context around my choice of Egypt as a case study. And like I was saying, during this period of British imperial decline, the British government was looking for new methods to continue exerting British power and influence throughout the empire in these informal ways. So my research question, therefore, broadly asks, what were these new methods of control and to what extent were they successful? And my thesis explores these questions by examining the ways in which Britain employed policies of economic control in Egypt during the interwar and post-war periods after the empire had begun its decline. So, like I said before, the thesis of free trade imperialism argues that there's a mutually reinforcing relationship between economic policy and political control. And in my research, I began with this assumption that the British used economic policy to reinforce or sometimes entirely replace its policies of political control within the informal parts of its empire. And in these regions, I expected to find that Britain often tried to negotiate favorable commercial agreements or treaties that were intended to secure British economic interests, but also to give the British government political leverage in future dealings with that country. And so to better examine this theory, I chose the case study of Egypt. You may ask, why Egypt? Well, Egypt in some ways is a representative case study to examine the role of economic policy as a potential source of political power within informally ruled regions of the empire. So first, and maybe most obviously, Egypt was an informally ruled territory within the empire. The British never fully ruled the country. In 1882, they occupied Egypt over financial and strategic concerns, and British officials remained in positions within the Egyptian administration until the end of World War I. This occupation was a little tricky, though, because when the British initially entered Egypt, they did so expecting to leave after about 2 or 3 years, and in the first couple months of this occupation, they actually drew up a plan for withdrawal that followed this timeline. But the occupation dragged on, and obviously the Egyptians grew increasingly frustrated. Yet this fact that the British had promised to leave and the fact that the British therefore had never exercised direct rule over the country meant that the British government had to come up with increasingly indirect ways to continue pursuing its political interests in Egypt. And one of the ways that it chose to do that was to use economic rationales to gain greater political influence over Egyptian affairs. Egypt also gained independence in 1922 after a successful popular revolution. I put independence in quotation marks because the British were still there. They were just pushed from all areas of the country except for the Suez Canal zone, which I will talk about a little later. But this also increased Britain's motivation to pursue political control through indirect means. Second, Egypt was a very important source of raw cotton to the British, third only to the US and India. And so when the British occupied Egypt, they focused on turning the country into what Egyptian political thinker Salama Musa called, quote, a gigantic cotton plantation. This type of narrow-minded development really hurt the Egyptian economy. It basically stopped the processes of diversification and industrialization, but it was great for the trade relationship between Egypt and Britain. So Egypt would ship raw cotton to Britain, and British mills would spin that cotton into textiles that were eventually exported back to Egypt. And during the British occupation, British cotton piece goods actually made up between 1/4 and 1/3 of all of the goods being imported into Egypt. It is important to remember, though, that Egypt was definitely not the most important source of cotton for the British. That was undoubtedly the United States. Egypt was important enough, though, that the British could justify seeking a favorable trade relationship with the nation, even if those closer economic ties were actually a means to exert more political control over the country. So again, when we're thinking about indirect rule and cotton, Egypt is a representative case to study the effects of those factors on British economic policy. However, I also identify 2 factors that make Egypt unique in the study of the British Empire. First, Egyptian nationalism was a uniquely strong and cohesive movement. There was like this deep sense of shared history and culture and ancestry within the Nile Valley that created a very strong common bond between the Egyptian people. And early on, modern Egyptian nationalist movements found a very strong group of followers in speaking out against the British occupation and the unfair economic and social circumstances of this occupation. In the early 1900s, the Party of the Nation emerged out of a group of intellectuals and landowners who were driven by Western ideals of sovereignty and self-determination. And during World War I, the Party of the Nation gained legitimacy and strength in speaking out against British martial law, which had been imposed during wartime, and the economic hardships of the war. So after the war, the leader of this party, who was a man named Said Zaghloul, demanded the formation of an Egyptian delegation, or a WAFD, to go to the Paris Peace Conference and make the case for Egyptian independence. Instead, his request was denied and he was exiled, and the country exploded into what is now known as the Egyptian Revolution of 1919. 5 years later, in 1924, after nominal independence had been granted and a new Egyptian constitution had created a new parliament, the WAFD party actually won the majority vote in parliament, and Zaghloul won the seat of prime minister. So the fact that a nationalist anti-British political party held the majority in government was obviously a threat to British authority in Egypt. And this threat provided a unique motivation for the British government's continued agenda of political interference in Egyptian affairs, even despite this lack of formal power over Egypt. And finally, Egypt is also an exceptional case for the Suez Canal. The canal dramatically shortened the route to India, which was one of Britain's primary trade partners and most important colonies. It was also an extremely important defensive position for the empire in the Middle East. Stephen Morewood referred to the canal as the, quote, jugular vein of the British Empire. And the base at Suez was essential during World War I, when the British troops there defended against a series of Turkish attacks to great success. And the importance of the canal during the war prompted a Suez fixation in the years to come. So the Suez Canal represented this bastion of imperial strength and power in the Middle East. And it also came to hold really great psychological as well as defensive value to the British. Its protection drove much of British policy in Egypt during the interwar and post-war periods, and its sheer importance to the empire also makes Egypt an exceptional case study to study the interplay of economic policy and political power during this time. So just to summarize, because I know that was a lot, I chose Egypt because it was both a representative and an exceptional case within the British Empire. It was representative because it was informally ruled and because the cotton trade was important to the British economy. And it was exceptional for the strength of its nationalist movements and the importance of the Suez Canal to British imperial defense. So to examine the relationship between British economic policy and political power in Egypt, I relied on archival documents from the British Board of Trade, the British Foreign Office, and the British Cabinet. I wanted to construct a comprehensive historical narrative of British economic policy in Egypt between 1930 and 1952. Last year, I was awarded a grant and I traveled to the UK for a week and conducted the bulk of my primary source research at the National Archives in Kew. Here's a nice picture I took of it. It reminds me of when the archives were open and we could still travel, but continuing on. So like I said before, I began my research with the assumption that the British used economic policy to reinforce its policies of political control in Egypt. This is basically the free trade imperialism thesis. I expected to find that a lot of what Britain did in Egypt was to negotiate favorable commercial treaties or agreements with Egypt to secure its political interests in the country. And what I found initially seemed to support that argument. But as I looked closer, I realized that economic policy didn't serve the simple purpose that I'd assumed. As I started looking through my sources and putting together my chapters, I actually found that what was going on was a little bit more nuanced than what I had believed. So that brings me to the main argument of my thesis. I argue that the British government never intended for economic policy to reinforce or replace policies of political control in Egypt, and instead that the British government employed economic policy in two very specific ways. So first, they employed it when political negotiations were not possible. And second, they employed economic policy when the government needed a cover up for politically damaging actions. So between 1930 and 1952, the British relied on these two uses of economic policy in very different ways. And to show you an example, I will walk you through what I thought were some of the most interesting years in Anglo-Egyptian history, which were the years of World War II. I do want to preface this discussion with two things. First, I want to introduce you to a couple of characters that will play a very important role in this discussion. So we have Sir Miles Lampson, who was the ambassador to Egypt from 1936 to 1946. We have Farouk I, who was the king of Egypt from 1936 to 1952. And we have Mustafa al-Nahas, who served as prime minister for various terms, both before, during, and after the war. And Nahas was a member of the Wafd Party, which, as you recall, it was the nationalist party in Egypt. And I also want to give a brief overview of both Egyptian and British priorities during the war. Talk you through what did both sides want and how could those wants potentially be a source of tension. So first we have the British. Britain wanted to maintain its base at Suez. Like I said before, Suez was an extremely important defensive position for the Allies during the war, and the British did not want to risk losing this position. And as a result, the British also wanted to secure Egyptian political loyalties during the war. They needed to ensure that the Egyptian government was fully cooperative so that they didn't threaten their defensive position at Suez. And second, we have the Egyptians. The Egyptian government initially was worried about the cotton farmers. As mentioned, the Egyptian economy was very, very dependent on this industry of raw cotton production and therefore very vulnerable to fluctuating market prices that were caused by the uncertainty of the wartime economy. And the Egyptians also wanted a guarantee of full independence at the end of the war. This by far trumped the protection of the cotton farmers as a priority. This had been Egypt's #1 goal for some time, of course, but the events of the war definitely brought the demand for full independence to the forefront. And as we'll see, these conflicting priorities drove much of Anglo-Egyptian relations during the war. So we'll first talk about how the British government used economic negotiations as a secondary negotiating tactic during the war, basically in times when political negotiations were not an option. So in mid-1939, the British government began to prepare for the worst. War was looming, and the empire wanted to ensure that the Egyptian cotton trade continued during the war. And so to secure a continued supply of Egyptian cotton, the British Board of Trade asked Miles Lampson to propose the institution of a cotton quota system, where the British could directly control the amount of cotton that was coming into the country. Unfortunately, the Wafd Party believed that this gave the British government way too much control over the Egyptian cotton supply, and they wanted to protect the interests of their cotton farmers, and so they rejected the proposed bill when it reached the parliament. And so given this nationalist platform of the Wafd Party, it really didn't want to engage politically with the British. The Wafd didn't want to pass any legislation that would benefit the British at the expense of Egyptian interests, as we see here. And the British, seeing that the cotton quota bill had been rejected, therefore saw that negotiating from this overtly political position with the Wafd would not get them what they wanted. And they therefore turned to economic negotiations as a secondary tactic to secure the cotton supply during the war. And so Lampson wrote to the British Foreign Office after the cotton quota bill had failed to pass, and he listed a number of special measures that he was willing to pursue to ensure that the British could control the cotton supply during the war. And these are the two measures that he explicitly described in his telegram. First, he suggested just flat out purchasing the entire Egyptian cotton crop. So obviously, the British were very desperate to ensure that they didn't lose their cotton supply during the war. And second, he offered to give insurance to any shipments of Egyptian cotton on British or neutral ships that were headed towards any ports in the British Empire. So again, we see that the British were working very hard to secure cotton at the beginning of the war. Interestingly enough, these special measures, as we can see, all arrived in the form of economic concessions. And as we can see also, they aligned with the first Egyptian wartime priority that I discussed, which was the protection of the cotton trade, the protection of the cotton farmers. So here we see that the British government at the beginning of the war was actually willing to engage in economic negotiations and make concessions to get what it wanted. And of course, we do need to note that Lampson and the British only turned to these economic negotiations once political negotiations seemed infeasible, just given the anti-British leanings of the Wafd and the unlikelihood that the Wafd would give in to British political overtures. And so this is one prime example of how the British used economic policy as a secondary tactic when political negotiations were not possible. So now let's take a look at this second use of British economic policy as a cover-up for the government's politically damaging actions. This comes out in full force during World War II, and spoiler alert, it doesn't work. It absolutely fails to cover up the damage of the British government's political interference during the war. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So Lampson and King Farouk, they generally had an amicable relationship. They were united on one critical point, which was that they both disliked the Wafd Party. Lampson obviously didn't like the Wafdists because they were anti-British and strongly nationalist. And the king didn't like the Wafd because their nationalist platform held a lot of sway over the Egyptian people, and that threatened his authority as the king. So neither Lampson nor the king wanted a Wafdist prime minister, and from 1939 to 1942, they worked together to try and prevent this from happening. But we're going to jump forward in time a little bit to 1942, which was not a good year in Egypt. Food shortages and rising prices were frustrating the Egyptians, and the growth of the Allied base at Suez was giving rise to strong anti-British sentiments among the Egyptian people. There was a lot of unrest in the major cities of Alexandria and Cairo. And one of the most worrisome aspects of this unrest to Lamson and the British was that many of the protests were growing increasingly pro-fascist in nature. This was obviously not good, given that Egypt and the Suez Canal were so important to Allied defense during the war, and the protection of the canal was one of Britain's first priorities. They did not want the Egyptians to support the fascist cause. So given these circumstances, Lamson actually had a change of heart. He began to advocate for the appointment of a Waftist to the premiership because he believed that he could successfully work with a Waftist prime minister to manage the unrest in the cities. And he also thought that working with a Waftist would gain some Egyptian popular support to the British side. So he asked Farouk, who had the power to select the new prime minister, to appoint Mustafa al-Nahas to the premiership. And Nahas and Lamson had actually worked together previously in the 1930s. They had succeeded in negotiating the biggest political milestone between the two countries, which was the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936. And given this history of success, Lamson supported Nahas's reinstatement to the prime minister position. He said the following. He said, if Nahas had worked well with us in peacetime, he would work tenfold as well in wartime. What he wanted was real democracy and real cooperation with us. So you can see that Lamson had a pretty high opinion of Nahas. However, Farouk said that he would only accept Nahas if Nahas would lead a coalition government rather than a purely Waftist one. Like I said, King Farouk viewed the Waft party as a threat to his power. And Lamson told Nahas to say this, and Nahas basically responded that he had very little faith in the efficacy of a coalition government and that a purely Waftist one was the best option. So negotiations were lagging. And as negotiations lagged, the external circumstances of the war were also growing increasingly urgent. German General Erwin Rommel was advancing in the western deserts of Libya, which is right next to Egypt, and the British government was growing worried about the speed of Rommel's offensive. And the Foreign Office was therefore pressuring Lamson to act really decisively on the matter of the new prime minister because they didn't want an unstable government in Egypt during this time. But by February 4th, 1942, Lamson still hadn't gotten an answer. Farouk had not complied with his requests. So that evening, in a series of events now known as the Abdeen Palace incident, Lamson showed up at the king's door with a convoy of British officers and surrounded the palace with armed troops. And he presented the king with abdication papers, and he gave this ultimatum: you have to approve Nahas or give up the throne. And just given that the armed British were literally knocking at his door, the king was forced to accept the terms, and Nahas became the new prime minister. So obviously, Lamson's actions on February 4th went way beyond the scope of British authority in Egypt. They clearly represented an act of political coercion in order for the British government to get what it wanted, which was Nahas as the new prime minister. And here we really see how the British government used economic diplomacy after the fact in an attempt to cover up the political damages of this incident. So following the events of February 4th, the British Board of Trade announced that it had agreed to purchase half of the entire Egyptian cotton supply for 1942. This announcement arrived right on the heels of the backlash over the Abdeen Palace incident and was no doubt intended to protect the British against the worst of this backlash. And what was the most interesting, or maybe the most sad about this whole thing, was that the British government didn't even seem to understand the extent of the political damage that it had done. In fact, as the war was winding down in 1945, Lamson, of all people, wrote to the Foreign Office stating here, and you can read it too, he said, in my opinion, our cotton buying policy in Egypt during the war has been extremely successful. So he believed, first off, that economic policy as a cover-up method had actually worked. Later in this document, he also goes on about how he thinks that the British would be able to retain close political ties with Egypt following the war. So he obviously believed that little to no political damage had been done. We, having the benefit of hindsight, know that a lot of political damage was done, and so I conclude that British economic policy, when used in this twofold way, first as a secondary tactic when political negotiation was not possible, and second as a cover-up method for more overt forms of political coercion, was ultimately unsuccessful. And the events of February 4th proved to the Egyptians that their quote-unquote independence was literally little more than a name, and that true independence would only come when the last British troops left Egypt. As a result, the British base at Suez became a rallying point for nationalists in the post-war years, And the Second Egyptian Revolution of 1952 would finally put into power a government of new nationalist leaders that would negotiate the total evacuation of the British from Suez. And King Farouk would live out the rest of his days in exile. He died in Italy in 1965. So we've looked at the story of World War II, and now we'll move on to the last portion of my presentation, which is the significance and takeaways from my work. So many studies have sought to define the relationship between economic power and political influence. For example, Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye wrote a seminal book entitled Power and Interdependence in 1973. And this is a very, very high level view of their argument in that book, but they basically laid out this idea of complex interdependence, or the idea that multiple channels, including economic channels, connect nations and direct transnational relations. So they found that when interdependence was asymmetric, when one state was more economically reliant than the other, this represented a source of power. And the more powerful state in that relationship would be able to pursue its political interests through a process of economic bargaining. Very significantly, however, they also found that an economically interdependent relationship does not imply that that relationship is also a cooperative one. So in the case of Britain and Egypt, this is obviously true. Just because the countries had a pre-existing economic relationship does not mean that the Egyptians were willing to comply with British political desires. And this is just one example of how my thesis fits into the larger literature regarding how states might employ economic policy as a means to gain political power in varying ways. You might be wondering though, how do my findings relate to what we're living today? I'm writing about a period of time that's now almost 70 years old. Are the lessons that we take away from this period of Anglo-Egyptian history still relevant to us now? And my answer is a resounding yes. Although we don't live in a time where literal empires rule the earth, it is a little bit harder to find current examples that are exactly analogous to this case. However, my thesis does broadly deal with the relationship between economic and political power and the way that this relationship affects the way that countries relate and act with one another. And we do live in a time where the perceived link between economic policy and political power affects our own country's foreign policy and decision-making every single day. So our current president, Donald Trump, promotes the deep-rooted belief that economic policy and political power go hand in hand. Unfortunately, he is stuck a little further back than 19th century British free trade imperialism. He is fully in the mercantilist era of the 17th and 18th centuries. He has stated explicitly in the past that he thinks trade is a zero-sum game, which is a very mercantilist idea. And Trump has been embroiled in a very aggressive and ongoing trade war with China since 2018, in the hopes that aggressive economic policy against China will force the Chinese to comply with American desires. And I do recognize that this case is a bit different. America and China are much more on the same playing field in terms of political power and economic power than Britain and Egypt were in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But we see here that Trump quite literally employs economic policy as a means for political coercion, although some may argue that pure diplomacy might be a better and less destructive approach to US-China relations. And as Trump continues this trade war, however, the possibility for political reconciliation between the US and China grows bleaker. But he does continue to assert that the trade war will result in more concessions from China to the US, and quote unquote, when he wins, the US will ultimately have proven itself as the tougher and more powerful state. So here are some thoughts that I'll leave you with. First, my thesis finds that British economic policy as a means to exert political control in Egypt was ultimately a failure. Economic policy did not work as a secondary tactic to political negotiations, nor did it work to cover up politically damaging actions after the fact. And in the short run, this failure resulted in the end of British presence in Egypt and the complete evacuation of the Suez Canal base by 1956. But this thesis also arrives at a really uncertain time in world politics, and it does have relevance today. Governments are facing the dual collapse of the world economy and the threat of a virus that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and infected millions more. The need for political goodwill and cooperation today between countries grows ever more important in the face of the global pandemic. And the British Empire may have existed in a different world from the intensely interconnected one that we inhabit today, but I do think it offers some important lessons. We can learn about the economic policy structures that guide and facilitate diplomatic success and those that don't. We can also learn from the failure of the economically and politically coercive methods that the British used to maintain influence in Egypt. But ultimately, I believe that the most important takeaway today is that we do need to learn where our limits are. That is to say, we must learn the extent to which political goodwill can be salvaged by forms of economic diplomacy and when relations have been damaged beyond repair. Thank you, and I yield my time to questions.